The morning air along the coastline was calm, almost eerily calm. Fishermen had just begun pushing their small boats into the waves when someone noticed a dark shape drifting closer to shore. At first, they thought it was just another piece of wreckage, nothing unusual for a place where storms often spit back the remains of ships long forgotten. But as the tide carried it nearer, whispers spread quickly across the dock. This wasn't just any wreck. It was a boat. Old, weather-beaten, scarred by salt and time, but strangely intact. When the villagers pulled it in, they froze. The name painted along its bow was faint, the letters eaten away by years at sea, but still legible enough to read. It was a name they all knew. The same boat that had vanished 12 years earlier, the same one belonging to a man who had sailed out one quiet morning and was never seen again. Inside, there was no crew. The deck was coated with barnacles, ropes stiff and brittle, nets torn and useless. A jacket, still hanging in the corner, looked as though it had been left only yesterday. A logbook, its ink blurred and pages swollen from seawater, stopped suddenly on the very day the fisherman disappeared. No signs of struggle, no trace of a body, just silence. For the families who had long mourned his loss, it was like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. How could a boat vanish for over a decade, only to reappear without a single soul aboard? Where had it drifted all those years? And, most haunting of all, what really happened to the man who once stood at its helm? This is the story of a fisherman lost at sea and the chilling return of his vessel 12 years later without a crew. His name was Daniel Mercer. To most people in the small harbor town, he was more than just a fisherman. He was the kind of man everyone seemed to know. He had worked the waters since he was a boy, taught by his father who believed the sea could be both a provider and a thief, depending on how you treated it. Those who remembered Daniel would often speak about his quiet strength, the way he always rose before dawn, how he never seemed to complain about the back-breaking labor that defined his life. Daniel wasn't wealthy. His boat wasn't large or fancy, just sturdy enough to withstand the endless battles with salt water and storms. Yet he carried himself with a calm determination that made people trust him. Neighbors often said, "If there's one man who can find his way back, it's Daniel." Perhaps that's why his disappearance all those years ago struck so deeply. Because he was the last person anyone expected to vanish. At home, Daniel had a family who adored him. His wife Margaret would wait for him on the porch each evening, watching the horizon until the little boat's silhouette appeared against the setting Sunday. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both young at the time. To them, their father was a hero, someone who braved the unpredictable ocean each day so they could have food on the table and clothes on their backs. He wasn't perfect, but he was steady, and in a life built around uncertainty, steadiness mattered more than anything. Friends described him as cautious on the water. He never ignored a storm warning, never pushed his luck too far out. He carried the same old compass his father had once used, and he often joked that as long as the needle pointed north, he'd never be lost. That compass, however, was never recovered. In the weeks before he vanished, nothing seemed unusual. He laughed with neighbors at the docks, fixed torn nets in the evenings, and even planned a short trip inland to visit his sister. No one could recall any sign that something was wrong, which made the day he sailed out and never returned all the more baffling. For 12 long years, Daniel Mercer existed only in memory and photographs, a face framed on a mantle, a story retold among fishermen as both a warning and a mystery. His boat's sudden reappearance forced everyone to revisit the man they thought they knew so well, a man grounded in routine, careful by nature, yet swallowed by the sea without explanation. Who was Daniel Mercer in his final hours? And why did his vessel return, long after his own fate had been sealed by the ocean's silence? It was the morning of the 14th of September, 12 years ago. The day began the way so many others had for Daniel Mercer. He rose before the sun, the house still quiet, his children asleep, the air carrying the faint chill of the changing season. Margaret later said she remembered the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, the soft clatter of the kettle as he poured himself coffee. Nothing about that morning hinted at what was to come. Daniel kissed his wife on the cheek before stepping out into the dim light of dawn. The tide was favorable, and the sea, from the shoreline at least, looked calm. He had spoken the night before about heading farther out than usual, hoping to bring in a larger catch before the weather shifted later that week. For a man who always kept his routine simple, it wasn't unusual. Margaret remembered him saying he'd be back before dark. At the docks, a few other fishermen saw him preparing his boat. He checked his nets twice, adjusted the lines, and made sure the small engine was running clean. Nothing out of the ordinary, one of them recalled years later. He waved casually to a friend as he pushed off, his figure shrinking slowly against the vast gray horizon. That was the last confirmed sighting of Daniel Mercer alive. By mid-afternoon, the weather began to turn. Not a storm, at least not by the standards of the coast, but the kind of restless shift sailors can sense even before the first dark clouds roll in. The wind stiffened, waves rose higher, and radios crackled with chatter between boats deciding whether to head in. Yet Daniel's voice was never heard. His vessel did not return to harbor, as the others did. At first, no one panicked. Delays happened. Sometimes the catch was better farther out, and Daniel was known for patience. But as evening fell, Margaret stood on the porch, eyes straining toward the water, waiting for the faint outline of his boat to appear against the sunset. The hours passed. Neighbors came out, scanning the shoreline, but there was only emptiness. By nightfall, concern turned into alarm. The Coast Guard was notified. Searchlights swept the waves through the night, helicopters circled overhead, and rescue vessels combed the routes Daniel was believed to have taken. For 3 days, the search continued. Pieces of driftwood were collected, but none could be identified as his. The ocean kept its silence. What made the disappearance so haunting was the absence of any trace. No distress call, no floating debris, no sign of capsizing. It was as though the boat had been plucked from the water and erased from existence. Friends at the docks struggled to understand it. Daniel had been too careful, too experienced, to make a reckless mistake. As days turned to weeks, the search effort dwindled. His family clung to hope longer than most. Margaret left a lantern burning in the window each night, a silent beacon for a husband who would never return. His children grew up with the memory of that night, etched deeply into their lives, the night their father sailed into the horizon and was swallowed whole by the sea. What happened to Daniel Mercer on that September day remains a mystery. But perhaps even more unsettling is what would happen more than a decade later, when the ocean decided to give one part of the story back. In the days following Daniel's disappearance, the small harbor town seemed to hold its breath. At first, hope carried everyone forward. The Coast Guard's search stretched for miles, extending well beyond the usual fishing routes. Neighbors gathered along the shoreline, scanning the horizon as if sheer willpower could pull the boat back into sight. Each report crackling through the radios, each sighting of an unidentified vessel made hearts race. But time, with its cruel patience, began to erode that hope. By the end of the first week, the official search was scaled back. Authorities explained that without new evidence, there was little more they could do. The sea was too vast, its currents too unpredictable. What remained was a private search, friends and fellow fishermen refusing to give up. They pooled fuel, set out in shifts, retraced routes again and again. Yet every trip ended the same way, with nothing. No broken oar, no life jacket, no trace of Daniel or his vessel. It was as though the ocean had opened up, swallowed both man and boat, and closed again without leaving a mark. For Margaret, the waiting became unbearable. Each night she lit the lantern in the window, a beacon against the darkness, her children falling asleep to the flickering glow. She prayed for the sound of boots on the porch, for Daniel's voice calling out from the dock. Instead, there was only silence. The children grew restless, asking questions she could not answer. Where did Daddy go? When will he come home? How could she explain that even the sea, which had once given them everything, had now given them nothing? Friends tried to comfort her, but grief has its own rhythm. Some said Daniel must have been lost in a sudden squall, his boat capsized before he had a chance to call for help. Others whispered darker theories, pirates, foul play, or worse. But none of it mattered, because none of it brought closure. Months passed. Seasons changed. Eventually, the town moved on, as towns must. Boats still launched each morning. Nets were still hauled each evening, and life continued on the tides. Yet for Margaret and her children, every sound of gulls crying above the waves was a reminder. Every boat returning safely was both a comfort and a wound. Their own vessel had never returned, and neither had the man who steered it. By the first anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, even those who had held on to hope began to accept the unthinkable. A memorial was held at the harbor, flowers scattered across the water. The crowd gathered in silence. Margaret stood with her children, watching the petals drift away on the tide. She did not cry, not then, not in front of others. Her grief had grown too deep for tears. And so Daniel Mercer became a story of fishermen lost at sea, another name in the long history of men taken by the ocean. His family carried on, but always with that hollow space, that unanswered question. For 12 years, the sea kept its secret, until, one morning, it gave something back. 12 years passed. The lantern in Margaret's window had long since gone dark. Her children had grown, the town had changed, and though Daniel's name was still spoken, it was now more memory than presence. Life along the harbor had settled into its familiar rhythm, boats pushing off at dawn, gulls circling overhead, waves breaking against the rocks. And then, one quiet morning, the sea returned what it had once stolen. It was a group of fishermen who saw it first. The sky was pale with early light when they spotted a shape drifting on the horizon. At first, they assumed it was just another piece of wreckage, carried in by the currents. But as the tide pulled it closer, their chatter faded into silence. What they saw was not debris. It was a boat weathered, scarred, but still intact. When they towed it ashore, a chill swept through the crowd that quickly gathered at the dock. The name etched along its bow was faded, but unmistakable. It was Daniel Mercer's boat. The very same vessel that had vanished without a trace 12 years earlier. Inside, the years had left their mark. The deck was encrusted with barnacles, the wood swollen and split from constant exposure. Ropes lay stiff and brittle, their fibers eaten away by salt. Nets, once neatly folded, were torn into ragged strands. Yet amid the decay, certain things remained hauntingly preserved. A jacket hung in the cabin, as though waiting for its owner to return. A tin mug sat in the corner, rusted but upright. And in a drawer, warped with water, lay Daniel's logbook. The pages were swollen, the ink blurred, but enough remained to be read. His handwriting trailed off suddenly on the day of his disappearance, the last entry noting calm seas and steady winds. There were no warnings, no frantic scrawls, no sign of fear, just an ordinary sentence, ending mid-thought as if the writer had been interrupted, never to return. But what struck everyone most was the emptiness. There was no sign of Daniel, no bones, no evidence of a struggle. The boat was intact, yet utterly deserted. It was as though its crew had simply stepped off into the waves, leaving everything else behind. News of the discovery spread quickly through the town. Old wounds reopened, and Margaret, now older, her children grown, stood at the dock once more, staring at the vessel that had once carried her husband into the horizon. For a moment, time collapsed, and she was again the young woman waiting on the porch for him to return. But there was no reunion here, only the ghost of what had been. The authorities examined the boat, searching for answers. They found nothing that explained the missing 12 years. Where had the vessel drifted all this time? How had it survived storms, currents, and the endless pull of the ocean only to return home? And most haunting of all, why had it come back, without the man who had once guided it? The harbor, once again, was filled with questions, but this time the sea gave no answers, only silence. When Daniel's boat reappeared after 12 silent years, investigators and townsfolk alike searched desperately for meaning. The vessel itself offered only fragments, weather-worn wood, corroded metal, and half-faded words in a logbook. Yet each detail became a thread, pulling people deeper into questions that seemed to multiply instead of resolve. The authorities began with the most practical explanation: nature. They noted that the boat's condition, barnacles, salt damage, broken ropes, was consistent with years of drifting. The theory was simple. Daniel had been lost at sea, perhaps swept overboard in a sudden accident, leaving the boat to wander the ocean currents. Carried by winds and tides, it could have circled the Atlantic, even touched distant shores, before eventually drifting home. On paper, it made sense. But those who knew Daniel struggled to accept it. He was careful, cautious, a man who had survived countless storms. Could he really have vanished so suddenly, without even a call for help? Then came another possibility: piracy or foul play. Some speculated that Daniel had encountered men at sea who boarded his vessel, took him, and abandoned the boat. But the theory collapsed quickly. The logbook showed no signs of interruption or panic. The cabin had not been looted. Tools, clothing, even coins in a tin box remained untouched. If someone had attacked him, why leave everything behind? Others wondered about equipment failure. Perhaps the radio had broken, or the engine stalled, forcing Daniel into a desperate situation. If he had attempted to repair something, leaning over the deck, a single misstep might have dragged him into the water. Still, even in such a case, the boat should have been found sooner. Search teams scoured those waters for weeks, and yet not a trace was seen. How could a vessel so intact simply vanish from the eyes of trained rescuers, only to reappear a dozen years later? Then there were the stranger theories, the ones whispered more than spoken. Some locals recalled seeing mysterious lights on the horizon around the time of Daniel's disappearance. A few suggested he may have been caught in something unexplainable, a kind of maritime phenomenon that defies reason. The ocean has long been a cradle for legends: ghost ships, cursed waters, places where time itself seems to warp. To those inclined to believe, Daniel's empty boat was another chapter in that long, unsettling lore. The discovery of the logbook only deepened the mystery. Investigators studied the final entries carefully. On the last day, Daniel had written about calm seas and steady winds. There was no sign of distress, no mention of storms or equipment failure. The words ended mid-sentence, not trailing off like a man distracted, but cutting sharply, as if something stopped him in an instant. The ink, though blurred, suggested the pen had been lifted suddenly. It left behind a silence that no one could interpret. In town, conversations shifted from speculation to obsession. Men at the docks debated every possibility: currents, storms, human error. Families gathered in kitchens, whispering about darker explanations. Margaret, now gray-haired and tired, said little. She had lived 12 years with unanswered questions, and the return of the boat gave her no comfort, only more shadows where closure should have been. Some of the younger fishermen treated the boat as a warning. They claimed the sea keeps what it wants and returns what it doesn't, but never with explanations. Superstition spread quickly. Few refused to sail the routes Daniel once favored, convinced those waters carried a curse. Others believed the boat itself was haunted, an empty vessel carrying echoes of its lost captain. For investigators, the final report offered little. They concluded Daniel Mercer was presumed drowned, his boat carried away by unpredictable tides, returning only by chance. But the people who had known him, the family who had waited for him, the neighbors who had trusted his skill, remained unsatisfied. There was nothing ordinary about the boat's reappearance. It wasn't just that it had come back after so long, it was the condition, the timing, the unanswered silence surrounding its return. In the end, the theories were many, but the truth was none. Nature, accident, foul play, or something beyond understanding the ocean, never clarified. What remained was a vessel emptied of its crew, a family emptied of their father, and a community left with questions that will likely never find answers. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of the story. The boat returned, but Daniel Mercer never did. The return of Daniel Mercer's boat did not bring peace. If anything, It stirred old griefs that had been carefully folded away. For Margaret, seeing the vessel again was like facing a ghost. She had lived 12 years with the ache of not knowing, and though the boat might have been expected to provide closure, it did the opposite. It reminded her of promises broken by the sea, of mornings spent waiting, and of the silence that had settled into her home after Daniel's disappearance. For his children, now grown, the boat was both a relic and a riddle. They touched the weathered wood with hands that had once held their father's rand, stared at the worn logbook as though answers might rise from the blurred ink. But nothing came. The sea had given them back a shell, not the man they had lost. They were left to wonder whether their father's final moments had been quick or drawn out, lonely or resigned, and those questions cut deeper than the years of absence ever had. Among the townsfolk, the story became legend. Fishermen spoke of Daniel Mercer in hushed tones, his fate a reminder of the ocean's indifference. Some said his boat was proof that no matter how skilled or cautious a sailor might be, the sea holds power beyond human understanding. Others insisted it was more than misfortune, that something unseen had claimed him. Theories faded and changed with each retelling, but one truth remained. No one could explain how a boat could vanish so completely, only to drift home more than a decade later. The harbor, once filled with curiosity, eventually grew quiet again. The boat was pulled ashore, examined, and left to rest, its hull too damaged to ever sail again. For years, it sat at the edge of the dock, weathering further under sun and rain, a silent monument to a man whose life ended in mystery. Children dared each other to climb aboard, while older sailors shook their heads, muttering that some things were better left untouched. In the end, the lesson was not about solving a puzzle, but accepting what cannot be solved. The ocean gives, and the ocean takes. Sometimes it returns what it has taken, though never in the way we hope. For the Mercer family, closure did not come from answers, but from the act of remembering, choosing to honor the man rather than the mystery. Daniel's story lingers still, a reminder etched into the collective memory of the town that even the most experienced, the most careful, can be lost in the blink of an eye. That the sea is not cruel, but it is not kind either, it simply is. And perhaps that is why stories like Daniel's stay with us, because they force us to confront how fragile we are and how much of the world will always remain beyond our understanding. If you've stayed with this story until the end, I'd love to hear what you think. Do you believe Daniel Mercer was simply lost to the sea, or is there something deeper, something we may never fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories of mysteries, disappearances, and the questions that linger long after the facts have faded, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep exploring the stories that the world has nearly forgotten, but that still echo in the silence. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and take care.